In 1725, a man walked into a room, looked at the one thing that had defined his entire life, and destroyed it. Not by accident. Not under pressure. He did it himself, deliberately, in front of witnesses. And then he walked away, without a word. No explanation came that day. No explanation came that week. No explanation ever came. And the question that moment left behind has never been answered in 300 years. Not whether the machine worked. That question matters, but it is not the deepest one. The deepest question is this: why would a man destroy the only thing that could prove he was telling the truth? Think about what that moment actually means. This was not a man caught in a lie, smashing evidence before it could be used against him. The machine had already been tested, already been witnessed, already been examined by some of the most respected scientific minds in Europe. Powerful men had seen it. Engineers had inspected it. And none of them had been able to explain it. So why, at the moment it mattered most, did the man who built it pick up a hammer and make sure nobody ever would? That is the question this story is built around. And I'll warn you now. The answer, when we get to it, is not the one most people expect. His name was Johann Ernst Elias Bessler. Born in 1680 in the small German town of Zittau, nothing about his early life suggested he would one day become one of the most controversial inventors in European history. He wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't backed by universities. He wasn't trained by famous scholars. What he had was something far more dangerous. Obsession. Because Bessler became convinced that one of the greatest limitations of his age had a solution nobody else could see. Every machine in the early 18th century depended on something. Water, wind, animals, human labor. Everything needed a source of power, and everything eventually stopped. Bessler believed that wasn't necessary. He believed motion, once properly arranged, could sustain itself. Forever. Most people dismissed the idea immediately. Inventors had been chasing perpetual motion for centuries, and every attempt ended the same way. The machine slowed. The machine stopped. The promise collapsed. Bessler believed everyone else was wrong. And in 1712, he announced that he could prove it. He had built a wheel, a large wooden wheel nearly 12 feet across. No water driving it, no wind, no visible source of power. Just the wheel. Turning. The crowds that came to see it expected a trick. The engineers who examined it expected to find a hidden mechanism. The officials who witnessed it expected to find the moment the motion finally died away. None of them found what they were looking for. The wheel kept turning. And then Bessler did something that revealed just how completely this machine had taken over his life. He reinvented himself. Using a simple letter cipher, he transformed his surname into a new identity. Orffyreus. That was the name he began using publicly. Think about that for a moment. Most inventors name their machines. Bessler became his. Over the next several years, he built larger versions. Each one attracted more attention than the last. Each one brought new witnesses, new examinations, and new arguments. And every one of them left behind the same unanswered question. What was actually making the wheel move? Then, in 1717, came the test that should have settled everything. A sealed room. A locked door. Guards stationed outside. No one allowed in. No one allowed out. Inside sat Bessler's wheel. When that door finally opened again, what the witnesses found would transform Johann Bessler from an unusual inventor into one of the greatest mysteries in the history of science. And it would begin the chain of events that ended with a destroyed machine, a ruined reputation, and a question that remains unanswered 300 years later. The test took place inside Weissenstein Castle in Kassel, Germany. The man who arranged it was Karl, Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel. And the fact that Karl was involved at all is the first thing about this story that tends to stop people. Karl was not a man who impressed easily. He governed a German principality, managed military affairs, handled diplomacy, and had spent much of his life surrounded by inventors, visionaries, and self-proclaimed geniuses, all seeking the same thing. A wealthy patron. He had seen extraordinary claims before. Most of them fell apart under examination. Yet when Karl encountered Johann Bessler, he came away with a different impression. Not certainty, not blind belief, but enough confidence to offer something no inventor could have asked for from a ruler of his stature. A serious test. Not a public demonstration lasting an afternoon. Not an exhibition where observers stood at a distance and watched the wheel spin. A test designed to eliminate the simplest explanation. Human intervention. Bessler's wheel was installed inside a room at Weissenstein Castle. The door was sealed. A wax imprint was placed on the lock, so any attempt to enter would leave evidence. Guards were posted outside. Then everyone left. The wheel remained inside. Alone. Days passed. Then weeks. The seal remained untouched. The guards reported nothing unusual. And the wheel continued turning. For 54 days. When the room was finally opened, Karl documented what he found. The wax seal was intact. No evidence of entry. No evidence of tampering. And according to the witnesses present, the wheel was still spinning. That result should have ended the argument. Instead, it made the argument larger. Because once the story spread beyond Kassel, it began attracting the attention of people whose opinions carried weight across Europe. One of them was Willem Gravesand, a Dutch mathematician and physicist, a professor at Leiden, a man who corresponded with Isaac Newton and understood mechanics at a level few people alive could match. He was not the kind of person who travelled across Europe chasing rumours. He came because the reports coming from Kassel were serious enough that he believed they deserved investigation. And when he arrived, he did what any careful scientist would do. He looked for the trick. He examined the wheel. He studied the axle. He searched for evidence of a concealed mechanism or an external source of power. He pressed against the machine himself, attempting to understand where the force was coming from. And after all of that, he left with the same problem everyone else had encountered. He couldn't explain it. That point is important. Gravesand did not declare the machine genuine perpetual motion. He did not announce that Bessler had overturned the laws of nature. He simply admitted that after examining the machine, he could not identify the mechanism responsible for what he was seeing. For a scientist, that is a very different statement, and in some ways, a far more powerful one, because it meant the mystery had survived direct investigation. The story continued spreading. Soon it reached another famous name, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, one of the greatest intellectual figures of the age, philosopher, mathematician, diplomat, and co-inventor of calculus. Leibniz never personally inspected the wheel, but he received reports from people who had. And those reports impressed him enough that he recommended serious investigation rather than immediate dismissal. Think about what had happened. A man who only a few years earlier had been an obscure inventor was now attracting the attention of princes, scientists, and some of the most influential thinkers in Europe. The wheel kept turning. The witnesses kept arriving. And nobody could provide a definitive explanation. Then came the opportunity that should have changed everything. The opportunity that should have made Johann Bessler wealthy beyond anything he had imagined. Because news of the wheel eventually reached one of the most powerful rulers on earth. And unlike the scientists, he wasn't interested in debating how it worked. He wanted to buy it. The man who wanted to buy the wheel was Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia, one of the most powerful rulers in the world. And he was prepared to pay an extraordinary amount of money for Bessler's secret. The price discussed was 100,000 thalers. To understand what that meant, consider that a skilled craftsman in Germany might earn 50 thalers in an entire year. 100,000 thalers was generational wealth, the kind of fortune that could transform a family forever. Bessler had spent years chasing recognition, years defending his machine, years submitting it to examinations and demonstrations. Now, finally, the reward seemed within reach. There was only one problem. Peter wanted to see inside, and Bessler refused. From his perspective, the logic was simple. The secret was the machine. Once someone saw the mechanism, they possessed the thing he was actually selling. If a buyer's representative inspected the interior before payment, what guarantee existed that the purchase would ever be completed? His position never changed. Payment first. Disclosure afterward. The buyers had an equally reasonable position. No ruler was going to transfer a fortune for a secret that had never been independently verified. And so the negotiation stalled. Neither side was entirely wrong. Neither side was willing to move. The wheel continued spinning. The money never changed hands. And over time, what should have been the greatest opportunity of Bessler's life slowly became the source of his greatest frustration. Because this pattern kept repeating. Scientists wanted to inspect the interior. Potential buyers wanted to inspect the interior. Patrons wanted to inspect the interior. Everyone wanted the same thing. The one thing Bessler refused to provide. For years he had been able to live with that tension. As long as the wheel continued attracting attention, as long as important people continued arriving, it was possible to believe a breakthrough was still coming. But eventually, something began to change. The patience started disappearing. The optimism started disappearing. And the people closest to him noticed it. The man who had once seemed confident and calculating became increasingly defensive. Every criticism felt personal. Every skeptical question felt like an attack. The wheel had become more than an invention. It had become his identity. A challenge to the machine was now a challenge to Johann Bessler himself. And that made what happened next far more dangerous. Because the threat that finally shattered everything did not come from a scientist. It did not come from a ruler. It did not come from an engineer who discovered the mechanism. It came from inside his own household. From someone who had spent years watching him work. Someone who claimed she knew exactly how the wheel operated. Her name was Anne. And what she said would destroy almost everything Bessler had spent 20 years building. Anne was a housekeeper who had worked in Bessler's household for years. She knew his routines. She knew his habits. She knew the difference between the public inventor who performed for princes and the private man who returned home at the end of the day. At some point, something between them broke. The exact cause remains unclear. What is clear is what happened afterward. Anne went public, and the accusation she made was devastating. She claimed the wheel was a fraud. Not partly fraudulent. Not exaggerated. Fraudulent from the beginning. According to Anne, the wheel never powered itself at all. She said she and her brother had secretly operated a hidden mechanism that drove the machine during demonstrations. She described concealed spaces, hidden cranks, a method through which motion could be transferred into the wheel without observers realizing what was happening. It was not a vague allegation. It was detailed, specific. mechanical, and most importantly, it came from someone who had lived inside Bessler's household. The accusation spread quickly. Within weeks, the same circles that had spent years debating the wheel were confronting a terrifying possibility. What if they had all been fooled? What if the mystery that had baffled scientists and fascinated rulers was nothing more than a carefully managed deception? For the first time in years, Johann Bessler found himself facing a threat he could not simply ignore. And his response would become one of the most controversial decisions in the entire history of science. Because instead of opening the machine and proving Anne wrong, he destroyed it. Bessler's response was not calm. It was not measured. And it was not the response most people expected. He did not invite investigators to examine the wheel. He did not open the housing and reveal the mechanism. He did not attempt the one thing that could have ended the accusation immediately. Instead, he destroyed the machine. Deliberately. Publicly. The wheel that had consumed years of his life, survived countless examinations, attracted the attention of kings and scientists, and passed the famous castle test, was smashed apart by the very man who had built it. For many people, that single act settled the question. An innocent man would reveal the secret. A guilty man would destroy the evidence. Case closed. Except the historical record is not nearly that simple. Because Anne's accusation contains a problem. A very serious one. One that has never been fully resolved. According to her account, she and her brother secretly powered the machine through a concealed mechanism connected to the wheel. At first glance, that sounds plausible. Until you remember the 54-day test. The sealed room. The wax seal. The guards. The fact that no one was supposed to enter or leave. If Anne's account is correct, then someone had to power the wheel during that test. How? Were Anne and her brother somehow hidden inside for nearly 2 months? That is not physically possible. Were they supplied secretly? If so, where is the evidence? How did guards, servants, officials, and Karl himself fail to notice? Anne's testimony never fully answers those questions. And that is where the story begins to become genuinely strange. Because historians are left with several possibilities. One possibility is that Anne was broadly telling the truth, but did not know exactly how the castle test was conducted. Perhaps there was another method, another hidden mechanism, something she was unaware of. A second possibility is that there really was a concealed access route that escaped detection. A third possibility is the one Bessler insisted upon for the rest of his life. That Anne was lying. Not mistaken. Not confused. Lying. The problem is that none of those explanations completely resolves the evidence. And the deeper researchers looked, the stranger things became. Because Anne's accusation had another weakness. It only addressed one machine. Bessler didn't build a single wheel. He built 4. The first appeared in Gera in 1712. The second in Draschwitz in 1713. The third in Merseburg in 1715. And the fourth in Kassel in 1717. 4 machines. 4 locations. Years of demonstrations. Years of witnesses. And Anne was not present for all of them. That detail matters. Because even if everything Anne said about the castle wheel were completely true, her testimony does not explain the earlier machines. The machines that existed before she entered Bessler's life. The machines that had already attracted attention. The machines that had already been examined. Those remain unexplained. Researchers have spent centuries arguing over what that means. Some see it as evidence that Bessler's deception was larger and more sophisticated than Anne understood. Others see it as evidence that her accusation, while dramatic, cannot fully account for the historical record. Neither side has been able to prove its case conclusively. And that uncertainty is what transformed Johann Bessler from a suspected fraud into a genuine historical mystery. Because both major explanations require something extraordinary. If Bessler was a fraud, then he maintained a deception across multiple locations for more than a decade while repeatedly surviving examination by intelligent and motivated observers. If Bessler was genuine, then a single accusation from inside his household succeeded in destroying one of the most remarkable inventions ever demonstrated. Neither explanation is simple. Neither explanation answers every question. What we do know is what happened to Bessler afterward. The accusation broke something in him. The inventor who had once negotiated with princes and corresponded with powerful patrons became increasingly isolated. The opportunities disappeared. The support weakened. The public debate that had once worked in his favor began moving against him. He retreated from the spotlight. He took on ordinary engineering work. He moved from project to project, trying to support his family. But one thing never changed. He kept building. And more importantly, he kept writing. Because during those years, while much of Europe had already reached its verdict, Johann Bessler began creating something that would outlive him by centuries. A document, 141 pages long, filled with drawings, filled with symbols, filled with clues. A manuscript that many researchers now believe may contain the closest thing we have ever had to the secret of the wheel. And if that's true, then the greatest mystery Bessler left behind wasn't the machine he destroyed. It was the document he chose to preserve. The manuscript had no title page, no explanation, no introduction telling readers what they were about to see. Just page after page of drawings. Mechanical sketches, wheels, levers, weights, pivots, strange arrangements of components that seem to alternate between practical engineering and elaborate puzzles. Today it is known as the Maßgannen Tractate. And 300 years later, researchers are still arguing about what it actually contains. To understand why the manuscript matters, you have to understand when Bessler created it. By the late 1720s, much of Europe had already made up its mind about him. The excitement surrounding the wheel was fading. Potential buyers were gone. Many of his most influential supporters were dead or aging. Anne's accusation had given skeptics a simple explanation they could point to whenever the subject arose. As far as the world was concerned, the story was over. But for Bessler, it wasn't. Because while public interest faded, the manuscript kept growing, page after page, year after year. And that fact alone raises an interesting question. Why would a man continue producing detailed engineering drawings if he had nothing left to gain? There were no wealthy patrons waiting to purchase them. No scientific institutions funding his work. No public audience demanding answers. The manuscript was private, which means whatever Bessler was doing, he was doing it for a reason that had nothing to do with performance. Some of the drawings are immediately recognizable. Overbalanced wheels appear throughout the manuscript, designs that attempt to use shifting weights to create continuous rotation. These concepts were not new. Inventors had experimented with them for centuries. And they always failed. As the wheel turned, the forces eventually balanced themselves out. The advantage disappeared. The motion stopped. Every serious student of mechanics understood that problem. Bessler understood it too. And that is what makes the manuscript interesting. Because he wasn't simply copying traditional designs. He was modifying them. adding secondary weights, adding pivoting arms, adding components that changed position during rotation. In drawing after drawing, the same pattern appears. A designer attempting to solve specific mechanical problems. Not imagining them. Solving them. That distinction matters. Because there is a difference between someone sketching a fantasy and someone refining a design after repeated experimentation. The Maskinen tractate often feels less like a collection of ideas and more like the notebook of a man working through failures. Trying something. Watching it fail. Changing it. Trying again. And then there is the other thing hidden inside the manuscript. The cipher. Scattered throughout the pages are encoded notes written using the same substitution system Bessler had used throughout much of his life. The same approach that helped create the name Orffyreus. At first glance, the coded passages seem almost unnecessary. This was a private manuscript. It wasn't intended for public circulation. Why hide information inside a document that nobody else was supposed to read? That question has fascinated researchers for decades. Because people do not usually encrypt meaningless information. They encrypt things they consider valuable, or dangerous, or important. Attempts to decode the manuscript have continued for generations. Some researchers believe the encoded sections contain direct mechanical instructions. Others believe they are clues designed to point toward a larger solution hidden within the drawings themselves. No interpretation has achieved universal acceptance. But nearly everyone agrees on one thing. The cipher appears to be discussing mechanics, not philosophy, not personal reflections. Mechanics. That possibility became even more interesting in 2011, when researcher John Collins published one of the most detailed studies of the manuscript ever attempted. Collins noticed something unusual. Across multiple pages, designs that appeared completely different on the surface shared remarkably similar geometric relationships underneath. The same proportions. The same structural patterns. The same underlying logic appearing again and again. His conclusion was controversial but fascinating. Bessler might not have been drawing dozens of different machines. He might have been drawing the same machine repeatedly, disguised within different designs, encoding one central idea through multiple illustrations. If true, it would explain why the manuscript feels so repetitive in places. Not because Bessler lacked new ideas, because he was trying to preserve one. Collins attempted partial reconstructions based on this interpretation. Some produced results that he believed resembled witness descriptions of the original wheel. Many researchers disagreed with his conclusions. The debate continues. But whether Collins was right or wrong about the specific mechanism, he helped establish something important. The manuscript is not nonsense. It contains genuine engineering thought, genuine mechanical analysis, and information that has not been fully extracted. 3 centuries after Bessler created it, researchers are still finding new patterns inside its pages, which raises an unsettling possibility. What if the most important thing Bessler ever built wasn't the wheel? What if it was the manuscript? Because unlike the machine, the manuscript survived. The wheel was destroyed. The secret, if there was one, vanished. But the pages remained, waiting for someone capable of understanding what their creator was trying to leave behind. And the deeper researchers looked into those pages, the more they discovered something that complicated the story even further. A statement Bessler made himself. One that almost nobody expects. Because at several points in his writings, Johann Bessler admitted something that a fraud almost never admits. He claimed he didn't fully understand why his own machine worked there is a particular kind of admission that a fraud rarely makes. A fraud usually has an explanation. It may be false. It may be deliberately confusing. But it exists. Because confidence is part of the performance. Johann Bessler said something very different. In several places throughout his writings, he suggested that although he could build the machine and demonstrate it, he did not fully understand the complete theoretical reason why it worked. At first glance, that sounds absurd. How can someone build a machine without fully understanding it? But history is full of discoveries that appeared before the theory needed to explain them. People used steam engines before they understood thermodynamics. They observed electricity long before they understood electromagnetism. They worked with phenomena they could see before they possessed the mathematics required to explain them. And that is where Bessler's story becomes particularly difficult to classify. Because if he was a fraud, this admission seems unnecessary. A man attempting to convince rulers and scientists that he had solved one of the greatest engineering problems of his age would normally present himself as completely certain. Not uncertain. Not confused. Certainly not willing to admit limitations in his own understanding. But if Bessler genuinely believed he had discovered something unusual through experimentation, then the statement becomes easier to understand. Remember the world he lived in. The laws of thermodynamics did not yet exist. The principle of energy conservation had not been formally established. The scientific framework that would eventually explain why perpetual motion is impossible was still more than a century away. That doesn't mean perpetual motion was secretly possible. It wasn't. But it does mean that people in Bessler's time lacked the theoretical tools we take for granted today. A person could observe something unusual and struggle to explain exactly what they were seeing. And that possibility has led some modern researchers toward a third interpretation of the story. Not fraud. Not genuine perpetual motion. Something in between. According to this view, Bessler may have discovered a mechanical arrangement that behaved in a way his contemporaries found extraordinary. A system capable of producing sustained motion far longer than conventional designs of the period. Not infinite energy. Not a violation of physics. Simply an unusually effective mechanical system that observers misunderstood because they lacked the language to describe it. Supporters of this interpretation often point back to the Maskanen tractate. The modified, overbalanced wheels. The shifting weights. The pivoting arms. The recurring attempts to address specific failure points in traditional designs. They argue that these are not the drawings of someone inventing fantasy machines. They are the drawings of someone solving engineering problems through trial and error. Critics disagree. They point out that many brilliant inventors have spent years pursuing impossible ideas. Technical sophistication does not guarantee correctness. A detailed notebook is not proof. An intelligent engineer can still be wrong. And that criticism is fair. Because ultimately, every theory about Bessler encounters the same obstacle. The machine no longer exists. We cannot inspect it. We cannot test it. We cannot open the housing and see what was actually inside. Everything depends on surviving documents, surviving testimony, and the interpretations of people separated from the events by 3 centuries. Which is why the central mystery remains stubbornly alive. Not because nobody has investigated it. Because everyone investigating it is forced to work around the same missing piece. The wheel itself. And yet one question continues to hang over the entire story. A question that becomes more difficult the longer you think about it. Why destroy the machine? If Bessler was a fraud, the answer seems obvious. He destroyed the evidence before someone else could expose it. Simple, direct, understandable. But if Bessler believed he had discovered something genuine, the answer becomes far more complicated. Imagine spending decades building toward a single achievement, submitting it to examinations, defending it against critics, watching powerful people promise support and then hesitate when the time came to commit, watching negotiations collapse again and again, watching your life's work become trapped between skepticism and curiosity. Then, finally, watching a public accusation threaten everything. In that situation, destruction begins to look different. Not like concealment, like refusal. If the world would not accept the machine on his terms, perhaps he decided the world would not have it at all. We cannot know if that was his reasoning. But it is one possibility among several. And perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that even Bessler himself was trapped inside the mystery. A man who had discovered something real but misunderstood it. A man who had convinced himself he possessed something impossible when he actually possessed something merely unusual. A man whose supporters and critics were both arguing about the wrong thing. Because if that interpretation is true, then the wheel may never have been what either side believed it was. Not perpetual motion. Not simple fraud. Something far stranger. A discovery that nobody fully understood. Not even the man who built it. And that possibility leads directly to the final chapter of this story. Because after 300 years of arguments, investigations, manuscripts, reconstructions, and competing theories, what remains is not an answer. It is a question. One that has somehow survived longer than the machine itself. Johann Bessler died on the 30th of November, 1745. He fell from a windmill he was constructing in Fürstenberg. He was 65 years old. And when people examined what remained of his workshop, they found something remarkable. An unfinished wheel. Not plans for one. Not a sketch. A real wheel, still under construction. Even after everything that had happened, the accusations, the destroyed machine, the failed negotiations, the years of controversy, Bessler was still building. Still experimenting. Still chasing whatever idea had consumed him for most of his life. And then, suddenly, he was gone. For a long time, history treated that as the end of the story. The verdict seemed obvious. A fraud had fooled some important people, been exposed, and spent the rest of his life refusing to admit it. Simple. Clean. Finished. Except history has a habit of becoming messy whenever people return to the original sources. Because the deeper researchers looked, the harder it became to fit Johann Bessler into a single category. Frauds usually leave explanations behind. Someone eventually discovers the trick. A hidden mechanism. A hidden partner. A document. A confession. Something. 300 years later, nobody has produced an explanation that accounts for every major piece of evidence. Anne's accusation explains some things. Not all of them. The clockwork theory explains some things. Not all of them. The genuine discovery theory explains some things. Not all of them. Every explanation solves one part of the puzzle and leaves another part untouched. And all the while, the same facts remain. 4 machines. Multiple locations. Years of demonstrations. Witnesses who could not identify the mechanism. A sealed room test that remains difficult to explain. A destroyed machine. And a manuscript that researchers are still studying today. The Maßgannen Tractate still exists. Its pages sit quietly in archives, carrying the same drawings, the same symbols, and the same unanswered questions they carried when Bessler first put ink to paper 3 centuries ago. The cipher remains only partially understood. The patterns remain debated. The central secret remains hidden. And that may be the strangest part of this entire story. Not that people are still interested, but that serious people are still interested. Historians, engineers, researchers, people who know perpetual motion is impossible, and yet still find themselves returning to Johann Bessler because the evidence refuses to fit neatly into a single explanation. Maybe Anne was right. Maybe the wheel was a sophisticated deception, and Bessler destroyed it because he knew the truth would eventually emerge. That possibility cannot be dismissed. Maybe Anne was wrong. Maybe the machine contained something genuine, and the destruction was the final act of a man who refused to surrender a discovery he believed the world had failed to value fairly. That possibility cannot be dismissed either. Or maybe the truth lies somewhere between those two extremes. A man who built something real but misunderstood what he had built. A man who made claims larger than the evidence justified. A man whose supporters and critics both oversimplified a much more complicated reality. We don't know. And after 300 years, that uncertainty may be the most important fact of all. Because most mysteries eventually shrink. New evidence appears. Documents surface. The unknown becomes known. Bessler's mystery has done the opposite. The more carefully researchers examine it, the more complicated it becomes. The wheel is gone. The man is gone. The witnesses are gone. Yet the question remains. Not because nobody has tried to answer it. Because nobody has answered it completely. And so we return to where this story began. A room. A machine. A man standing in front of the one object that could have settled the argument forever. He looks at it, raises a hammer, and destroys it. 300 years later, we still don't know whether that moment was the final act of a fraud protecting a lie or the final act of an inventor protecting a secret. Maybe the answer is still hidden inside the manuscript. Maybe it died with him. Maybe it was never what either side believed. Whatever the truth is, Johann Bessler succeeded in one thing. He made sure the question would outlive him. A wheel that turned. A machine nobody could explain. A secret locked inside a manuscript. And a mystery that, after 3 centuries,